I never expected anything unusual to happen on my 18th birthday. After all, life had been quiet in our house, routine, predictable, and often a bit distant. My name is Grace, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in a small, two-story house in Minneapolis with my parents, Lisa and Robert. It wasn't that we were unhappy. We just weren't a particularly affectionate family. I can't recall the last time my parents hugged me or told me they loved me. It wasn't that they didn't care, I suppose. They just had a way of showing it that was more practical than emotional. We didn't talk much about feelings. Our communication consisted mostly of mundane, everyday exchanges. Dinner was served at 6 p.m. sharp, and after that, we'd watch TV together, each absorbed in our own thoughts. It wasn't a bad life, just distant. I never minded the distance. In fact, it became normal to me. My parents didn't exactly spoil me with attention, but they gave me space. The house was always quiet, my room a sanctuary where I could escape the emptiness I sometimes felt when we were all in the same room. I kept to myself, preferring books and music to family outings or conversations. And yet, despite this emotional distance, I always thought there was a certain comfort in it. I had my life, they had theirs. The arrangement worked, and I saw no reason to question it. That morning, my 18th birthday, felt just like any other day. My mother didn't rush to make me breakfast, but she handed me a small envelope when I came downstairs. "Happy birthday, Grace," she said with a quick smile, almost like an afterthought. I opened the envelope to find a card, its words neatly written inside, but nothing more. There was no mention of any party or celebration. No cake, no balloons, just the card, a token gesture of affection. Still, I wasn't disappointed. That was how things were. And besides, I wasn't one to seek out grand gestures. I like things quiet and simple. Later in the afternoon, after the usual quiet lunch, my mom sat me down at the kitchen table. She had that serious look on her face, the one she used when there was something important to discuss. I had no idea what it could be. Maybe it was a financial issue or something about my future, but I wasn't expecting the conversation to go the way it did. "Grace," my mom started, her voice unusually soft, "there's something we need to talk about." I looked up from my phone, curious, but not overly concerned. "What is it, Mom?" She hesitated, glancing at my father, who sat at the table silently, his eyes fixed on the newspaper. It was strange to see him so quiet, but I figured it was just another one of his "I'm thinking" moments. He wasn't the most talkative person. "Your father and I had decided to make a big change," she continued, her gaze now firmly fixed on me. "We've decided to sell the house and move to Europe. We've been offered an opportunity there to start a new business." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. I blinked, processing what she had just said. "Wait, what? You're moving to Europe?" "Yes," she said, her tone steady. "We're selling the house. Your father and I are going to start a new life there. We think this is the right move for us." I felt my stomach tighten. "But what about me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. "Well," my father finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the quiet tension. "You're old enough now to make your own decisions. We're not going to tell you what to do, Grace. But we've made our decision. This is happening." My mind raced. I could feel the weight of their words pressing down on me, the finality of it all. "When?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding almost foreign to my own ears. "In a couple of weeks," my mom replied, her expression unreadable. "We've already made the arrangements. The house will be on the market soon, and we'll be leaving for Europe right after that." I stared at her, my mouth dry. "You're leaving me?" I asked, the question barely a whisper. She looked at me, her face softening just a little. "Grace, this is a new opportunity for us. You'll be fine. You're old enough to take care of yourself now." I couldn't speak. My mind was swirling with 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to make it past the lump in my throat. I was 18. I was an adult now. But that didn't mean I was ready to be left behind. It didn't mean I was ready to lose the life I had known, the routine I had come to accept, and the parents I thought I knew. "What do you mean, take care of myself?" I finally found my voice, my words sharp with disbelief. You can't just leave. But my parents were already making plans. The move to Europe wasn't a discussion. It was a decision they had already made. They seemed so sure of themselves, so excited about this new chapter in their lives, that they didn't notice the shock on my face. And in that moment, I realized that I was no longer part of their world. The life I had known, quiet, distant, and routine, was about to end, and I wasn't sure what would come next. But I knew one thing for certain. I was about to be completely alone. The next few days passed in a blur. My parents were busy making arrangements for the move, packing their things, and discussing logistics that seemed so far removed from my reality. They never asked me how I felt, never considered how this sudden upheaval might affect me. Their focus was entirely on their new life in Europe, and I was just a spectator in the background. I spent most of my time in my room, scrolling through my phone or staring out of the window, trying to make sense of it all. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence more oppressive. The thought of them leaving, of everything changing so abruptly, gnawed at me. I had no idea how to deal with it. I couldn't even bring myself to confront them again. It felt like everything I knew was being ripped away, and I had no say in the matter. On the fourth day after their announcement, I finally broke down. I was sitting in my room, listening to music with the volume cranked up to drown out the noise of my racing thoughts, when I heard a knock on the door. "Grace?" It was my father's voice. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what I would say. Eventually, the door creaked open, and he stepped inside. He seemed hesitant, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "We need to talk," he said quietly, taking a seat at the edge of my bed. His gaze was soft, almost apologetic. I crossed my arms tightly across my chest, trying to hold myself together. "About what?" "The fact that you and Mom are leaving, and I'm being left behind." My voice trembled despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Grace, we didn't mean for you to feel this way. We've been planning this for months, and honestly, it's a big opportunity for us. We think it's for the best. For you, maybe." I shot back, my anger starting to bubble up.
"But what about me?"
"What do I do when you're gone?" "You're old enough to take care of yourself now," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "We believe you'll be fine on your own." "Fine," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. How am I supposed to be fine when my parents just decide to leave me behind like I'm nothing? My father's expression softened, but his eyes didn't soften enough to show any real emotion. "Grace, this is for the best. We're not abandoning you. It's just a new chapter in our lives. You'll understand one day." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to make him understand how wrong all of this felt. But I just sat there, feeling the weight of his words sinking in. "You're not leaving me behind," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "You've already done that. You've already made up your mind." He opened his mouth to say something, but stopped, looking like he didn't know how to respond. After a long pause, he stood up and nodded. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I'll give you space to think." With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence in the room felt unbearable. It was as if I was being smothered by the weight of everything that was happening. I wasn't okay. How could I be? I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. I had never felt so alone, so utterly abandoned. And worse, it was like my parents couldn't even see it. This wasn't just about the house, or about them leaving. It was about my entire life as I knew it being torn apart, and no one even noticing the pieces that were left behind. I stared out of my window, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze, as if life outside the house went on as usual. And in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Boxes piled up in every room, each one representing a piece of my parents' departure. I watched as they packed their lives into the back of a van, each item carefully wrapped, each memory sealed away. But what about me? Where did I fit into this mess of change? I tried to pretend everything was fine, to go along with the motions. I spent the next few nights at friends' houses, trying to avoid the feeling of emptiness that clung to the walls of the house. But no matter how far I went, the truth was always there, waiting for me when I returned. They were leaving, and I was being left behind. It was on one of those nights, as I sat in a cafe with some friends, that it hit me. My parents weren't just going on vacation. They were starting a new life. A life that didn't include me. The realization was like a slap in the face. They had made their choice. And somehow, I wasn't part of it. I texted my mom the next morning, asking if we could talk. She didn't reply right away, which only deepened my frustration. When she finally did respond, it was brief. "I'm busy right now, but I'll call you later." I didn't wait for the call. I couldn't. Instead, I sat down in the quiet of my room and let the silence consume me. Everything felt so final now, like no one was ever going to come back for me. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in my mind as I paced the empty hallway. The walls, once filled with the warmth of family, now felt cold and indifferent. I stood there, in the quiet aftermath of what had just unfolded, trying to process the gravity of the situation. I had always imagined that family would be there for me, especially when things went wrong. But reality had a different plan. They were the ones who let me down, the ones who chose to turn their backs on me when I needed them the most. It wasn't just the harsh words or the shocking betrayals. It was the fact that I had been made to feel invisible in my own home. For years, I had sacrificed so much for them, always putting their needs ahead of mine, hoping for a shred of appreciation, even the smallest recognition. But all of that had been for nothing. I could still hear my father's voice, cold and dismissive, telling me that it wasn't worth fighting for. My stepmother's indifferent gaze, filled with a mix of triumph and contempt, haunted me. They had everything they wanted, while I was left standing in the ruins of what I thought was my family. As I stood there, a wave of anger and hurt washed over me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal at its core. I had given so much to them, only to be tossed aside as if I didn't matter. But now, something inside me shifted. It was as if a spark had ignited, and with it, a determination I hadn't realized I had. I wasn't going to let this be the end. I couldn't just walk away and allow them to get away with what they had done. I needed a plan, a way to make sure they would understand the consequences of their actions. If they thought they could treat me like this and walk away unscathed, they were in for a rude awakening. I left the house that night with only a single bag of belongings, but I knew one thing. My journey had just begun. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but I would make them regret their choices. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. The days after I left felt like a blur. I moved into a small apartment in the city, a far cry from the mansion I had once called home. But in the chaos of change, I found something I hadn't expected: freedom. The weight of family obligations, the years of feeling invisible, had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the pressure of expectations bearing down on me. But freedom, as it turns out, came with its own set of challenges. The loneliness was sharp, and at night, when the silence of the apartment pressed in, I would sometimes think back to the life I had known. It wasn't just the physical absence of family that stung, it was the emotional void left in their place. I couldn't deny that I missed them, even if they had hurt me in ways I couldn't begin to explain. I spent the first few weeks in a haze, trying to establish a new routine. I found solace in simple things: morning coffee, late-night walks, and the occasional visit to a nearby park. Slowly, I started to rebuild my life, piece by piece, though it wasn't easy. There were moments when I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I should just give in and return to them, forget the betrayal, and try again. But then I would remember the look on my father's face when he turned his back on me. I couldn't undo that. I kept my distance from my family, choosing instead to focus on myself. I got a job at a small marketing firm, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was mine. I made new friends, people who saw me for who I truly was, not as the daughter of a wealthy family, but as someone with her own dreams and ambitions. Yet, despite all the progress I had made, I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. The anger I had buried deep within me still simmered, waiting to burst to the surface. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I had to take action. It wasn't just about proving myself to them. It was about reclaiming my own dignity, about showing them that I was worth more than they had ever believed. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city skyline, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, but then I answered. The voice on the other end made my heart race. It was my father. The moment I heard his voice, a surge of emotions swept over me. I had been expecting this call in a way. My father was never one to let things go without trying to fix them, but that didn't mean I was ready to hear what he had to say. My pulse quickened, and I almost hung up, but I knew I couldn't. This was the moment of truth. "Emma, are you there?" My father's voice was shaky, as though he was unsure of how to approach the conversation. I took a deep breath before responding, trying to steady my emotions. "I'm here, Dad. What do you want?" There was a long pause on the other end. He was searching for the right words, I could tell. The silence stretched out, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I know I messed up," he said. "I should have been there for you. I should have seen the pain I was causing, but I didn't. I was so caught up in my own world that I forgot about you, Emma." I felt a mixture of anger and sorrow welling up inside me. His apology, though it sounded sincere, didn't feel like enough. The years of neglect, the hurt I had endured at their hands, all seemed to surface in that one moment. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had betrayed me. But I couldn't. I had learned over the years that confrontation with him, no matter how much it hurt, would only leave me feeling more alone. "You didn't just mess up, Dad," I said, my voice low but firm. "You chose them over me. You chose your new life, your new family, over the daughter who had always been there for you. You left me to pick up the pieces." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, and I could almost picture his face, a mixture of guilt and regret. But I couldn't stop now. I needed him to understand, to feel the weight of what he had done. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice trembling. "But I want to make things right. I want us to be a family again, Emma." The words felt empty to me. How could I go back to that? How could I ever trust him again? After everything. I had been the one to hold our family together, and now I was supposed to forgive him just because he had finally realized his mistakes? "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I don't know if I can ever go back to what we were." The silence between us felt suffocating. I could hear his shallow breathing on the other end of the line, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything more. Part of me wanted to slam the phone down and end the conversation, but another part of me longed for resolution. A part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same again. The damage had been done, and it was too late to fix it. "I need time, Dad," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I need time to figure this out. I can't just forget everything." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I understand. Take all the time you need, Emma. I'll be here when you're ready." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I ended the call quietly, feeling both relief and sorrow. Part of me wanted to let the past go, to move forward and try to heal, but another part of me knew that this was just the beginning. There were so many unresolved feelings, so much anger, and so much pain. Could I ever truly forgive him? Could I ever trust him again? The phone call left me with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. Things were never going to be the same again. Days passed in a haze of confusion. I had hoped that the conversation with my father would bring some sense of clarity or closure, but instead, it had only left me feeling more conflicted. The promise of reconciliation, of a chance to rebuild what had been broken, seemed distant. I tried to focus on my own life, to move forward without looking back, but the weight of the past lingered like a shadow, impossible to shake off. It wasn't long before I began to notice strange things happening in my life. Small, seemingly insignificant events that began to pile up, each one pulling me further down a path I didn't want to walk. My father, despite his promises, had started showing up at my door uninvited. At first, I had welcomed him, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some deep, hidden desire to repair our relationship. But his visits quickly became more frequent, and each time, it felt like he was trying to guilt me into forgiving him. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home to find him sitting on my doorstep, waiting for me. His face, etched with worry, greeted me before I even had a chance to speak. "Emma," he said, standing up as I approached. "I know you're upset, and I know I can't just make everything right. But I want to try. I've been talking to your mother about you, about how we can fix this." My mother. Hearing her name again, after all this time, hit me like a wave. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She had been the first to leave when I was a child, chasing her own dreams and abandoning me in the process. And now, here she was again, lurking in the background, pulling the strings of my father's guilt. The idea of her involvement in this made me feel like I was being controlled, manipulated into a reunion I wasn't ready for. "I'm not interested in what you and Mom have been discussing," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've both had your chance. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened, trying to figure out where I fit into this mess. But I don't need your help, Dad. I've learned how to live without you." The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. It felt like every time I let him in, he pulled me back into a place I didn't want to go. He had been a stranger in my life for so long, and now he was trying to act like everything could go back to how it was. It wasn't that simple. He looked taken aback, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man who had once been my father, the man who had promised me the world. But that man was gone, and the reality of it hit me like a ton of bricks. "I'm sorry, Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know I've made mistakes, and I've hurt you.
But I don't want to lose you again.
I need you in my life." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hear those words and feel like they meant something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the years of abandonment, the years of hurt that I had carried with me. He had been there when it was convenient, when it suited him, but when I needed him the most, he was gone. "I don't need you to be sorry, Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I need you to understand. I need you to understand what you did to me. I need you to stop pretending like everything can just go back to normal." There was another long silence. He didn't seem to know how to respond to that. I could see the pain in his eyes, and a part of me wanted to soften, to tell him that I was willing to try, to give him another chance. But I couldn't.
Not yet.
Maybe not ever. As I stood there, facing him, the realization hit me with full force. I had spent so many years trying to repair a relationship that was beyond repair. The truth was, my father had chosen his new life over me long ago, and no amount of apologies or promises could change that. He had made his choices, and so had I. It was time for me to stop waiting for him to come back and start living my life without him. "I need space," I said quietly, my voice firm. "I need time to figure out who I am without you in my life." His face fell, and for a brief moment, I felt guilty. But the guilt was fleeting. I had spent too much of my life carrying his burden, and I couldn't do it anymore. I had to choose myself. "I understand," he said softly, his voice filled with resignation. "I'll give you the space you need. But I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me someday." I nodded, the weight of the decision settling in my chest. As I turned to walk away, I felt a strange sense of freedom. It was the first time in years that I had made a choice for myself, a choice that was not based on pleasing anyone else. And though the future felt uncertain, one thing was clear. I was no longer waiting for my father to save me. I had to save myself. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of the conversation lingered. I thought about everything my father had said, about the broken pieces of our relationship. But more than anything, I thought about the future. I had no idea what it held, but I knew that whatever happened, I was finally ready to face it on my own terms. The days following my conversation with my father were quiet, almost eerily so. I had spent so much of my life consumed by thoughts of him, by the unresolved anger and the unspoken pain, that now, with the silence between us, it felt like the world was holding its breath. For the first time in years, I had the freedom to think about my own life, without the constant pull of the past threatening to drag me back. I woke up every morning, my mind no longer clouded by what had been said or left unsaid between my father and me. It wasn't that I had forgotten him or that the pain had disappeared, far from it. But I had finally reached a point where I no longer needed him to validate my worth, to apologize for the things he couldn't undo. I had stopped seeking closure from someone who wasn't capable of giving it to me. Instead, I began to turn inward, to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by my past. Work had always been a distraction for me, but now it became something more. I threw myself into my career, focusing on projects that made me feel proud of myself. It was easy to lose myself in the hustle, in the demands of deadlines and meetings, but it was also the one place where I felt in control. Slowly, the work became a source of strength, a reminder that I was capable of more than I had ever given myself credit for. But it wasn't just work that helped me rediscover my sense of self. It was the people who had been there for me all along. My closest friends, those who had supported me through the worst of it, were the ones who helped me rebuild what had been lost. They didn't try to fix me. They didn't offer empty words of encouragement. Instead, they simply listened, offering me the space to be angry, to grieve, and ultimately, to heal. One of those friends, Maria, called me one afternoon. Her voice was excited as she spoke. "Emma, I know this sounds sudden, but I think it's time you finally let go of the past. You've been carrying so much for so long. Don't you think it's time to take the next steps?" I could hear the sincerity in her words, but for a moment I hesitated. What did she mean? Take the next step? I wasn't sure I was ready for anything, let alone moving forward in any significant way. "What do you mean, Maria?" I asked, my voice uncertain. She paused, then said, "I know this is a big ask, but I think you need to forgive yourself. I think you need to let go of the guilt you've been holding on to. You've spent so many years waiting for someone else to make things right, but it's time you made things right for you. It's time for you to move on." Her words hit me like a wave. I had always focused so much on what my father had done or hadn't done that I had never truly stopped to think about how I was holding myself back. How I had been punishing myself for things beyond my control. The idea of forgiveness, of truly letting go, was terrifying. It meant relinquishing the pain I had carried for so long. But as I thought about it, I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean that I had to erase the hurt my father had caused or pretend that everything was okay. It simply meant releasing myself from the shackles of anger and resentment and allowing myself the chance to move forward. That evening, I sat quietly in my apartment, thinking about everything that had happened over the years. I thought about the moments of joy, the moments of pain, the people who had come and gone from my life. And then, for the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future. The future that was mine to create. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew there would be days when the past would resurface, when the memories would threaten to overwhelm me. But I also knew that I had the power to choose how I responded to those moments. I could choose to keep looking backward, or I could choose to move forward, to make a life for myself that wasn't defined by the mistakes of others. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I wasn't waiting for my father to change, or for the past to be rewritten. I was moving forward, and that was enough. I picked up the phone and called my father. It wasn't a call to reconcile, but it was a call to let him know that I was okay. That I was finally okay on my own. He answered after the first ring. "Emma," he said, his voice filled with surprise. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "I just wanted you to know that I'm doing all right. I've been thinking a lot, and I've realized that I don't need you to fix anything. I've learned to fix myself." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought he might say something to change my mind, to bring me back into the fold of his world. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "I'm glad to hear that, Emma. I've always wanted the best for you, even if I didn't know how to show it." "I know, Dad. And I'm grateful for that," I said. "But I'm moving forward now. I have to." "I understand," he said softly. "I'll always be here if you need me." "I know," I said, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't the weight of my father's expectations or the weight of the past. It was the weight of the future, a future that was now mine to shape. And for the first time, I truly felt free.